I've written down some of my story. I'm trying to write the entire story, but you get sidetracked in the different snapshots of things that have happened, and you have these things that just indelibly engrave themselves in your mind, even from a very young age. But I read a book from Seth Godin once. It's a marketing book called Tribes.
Yeah.
And there was a quote in it. Says a fundamentalist is a person who considers whether a fact is acceptable to his religion before he explores it, as opposed to a curious person who explores first, then considers whether or not he wants to accept the ramifications. A curious person embraces the tension between his religion and something new, wrestles with it and through it, and decides whether to embrace the idea or reject it.
Welcome to Rettles Pub.
Is because I wanted to understand why can't I watch movies? I just don't understand why I can't watch movies. I don't understand why I can't wear shorts. I don't understand why I can't play sports. Why? And nobody could ever answer the why. Right. And I don't know if you know this or if you've listened, but I was prophesied over when I was 13 saying that I was going to die because I was rebellious by the time I was 30. That 29-year mark was really hard for me because
it was traumatic.
Yeah. And I was driving an hour to work every day. So if it's going to happen, it's going to happen in some fiery crash on the way to work. Right. And so, it was a scary time. But regardless, I think that's one of the things that I've come to believe is that, my belief in this, and I'll hardly ever say God. Sometimes I use it because it's common and then people have that understanding of it. But, this thing that exists outside my perception and outside my understanding, is it science? Is it spiritual? Is it whatever it is? I don't know. I can't explain it. But I want to understand what other people say, because you know what? You may not believe like I believe. And I'm okay with that, because you're going to say something at some point that I'm like, holy shit, that's fucking awesome. And if I'm looking at you like you're the spawn of Satan, I'm never going to hear what you got to say.
Exactly.
And if you're looking at me like I'm the spawn of Satan, you're never going to hear what I got to say. And at the point that it's me versus you and us versus them and this versus that, if I'm conspiratorial, which I tend to lean conspiratorial, it's almost as though that's instigated from whether it's mass media or politics or whatever. There's this understanding that if let's create division among the people, because God forbid the people who don't agree with each other actually come together and see each other as people. Then those who have power and control lose that power and control. And I think we're seeing a lot of that now. I don't know the last time I watched mainstream media on the left or the right. I don't give a fuck. It's all bullshit, and it's getting worse. And it's almost like they're trying to make it like, here, let me lie more so you come watch me more. Man, I have
an acceptable view of it.
Yeah. If anything, if they're both against something, I'm going to go look at whatever they're against to try to figure out if it's something I want to look into. I mean, that's kind of, and it's the same with the politicians. If the two politicians on both sides start liking something, I'm like, oh no, there's something going on right there. Or if they start hating something, there may be something I need to go check out, because they're either hiding something from me, they're trying to kill me, they're maybe not kill me, but you know what I'm saying. Although, who knows, I mean,
who knows?
There are chemtrails in the sky. I'm just saying.
Birds aren't real.
Exactly.
Oh man. Yeah. I've run across a lot of fundamentalist atheists,
Oh yeah.
Some of them have left Christianity and they didn't jettison the fundamentalism. And so they're atheists, but they're fundamentalist as could be. And I guess, in the last phase when I was on my way out, there was twice I seriously considered converting to Judaism. The first time I had my mind set up that I was going to start going to conversion classes. And then the FBI uncovered a plot. Some guy was going to assassinate the rabbi who did the conversion classes. And so for everyone's safety, they put those off. And so it kind of didn't become an option. And then the second time, they had started them again. And I was considered, but at that point, I considered myself an atheist. And I know that there are some rabbis who will convert you as an atheist. But at that point, I was like, it's just going to be an extra step. I'll just be a Jewish atheist if I do that. But there's just something about, I do have a respect for Judaism. And I guess a lot of it is based in the fact of the way that they handle their text. They are free to disagree, argue with their text. They can say, God did this and I don't like it. And they can carry that and it's not heretical. As a Christian, oh no, everything God does has got to be justified. And so, you read in the Bible, and, one of the big things that I generally argue, by my name, Sacred Cow Diner, that's the persona I kind of created to interact with faith and atheism. And I have a lot of discussions on Twitter on the subject of biblical slavery. And there's always this process. People, at first, are ignorant that it even exists. And then there's somebody made a meme that has 5 steps. And by the time you get to the 5th step, your arguments are contradicting your earlier arguments that you made. But once your earlier arguments were disproven, you have to move on to something else, And, eventually the can gets kicked to the New Testament. And, I made a video and it's like, have you seen what Jesus said about slavery? Because he talked about it and it ain't good. And not only him, Paul and, the New Testament writers, whoever they were, we know who the books are attributed to. And the thing is, at that time and in that culture, slavery is accepted. Even Aristotle, he believed, he postulated this idea of having natural rights. But he also believed that slavery was a status of life. Some people were born to be slaves. That was the class they were in, and that was perfectly acceptable and normal. And the world continued that way for 1,700 years before people finally realized, it's you only get credit to Enlightenment values of of why slavery was abolished. But I think even more so than that, we had thousands of years of data saying, man, this practice that we're doing is not helping us. It's making things worse for a lot of people. And especially in this country, we had a war that was largely centered around people who were, using the Bible to justify owning another human as property. But so, yeah, I argue, biblical slavery a lot. I guess I first got attuned to it. There was an atheist named Matt Dillahunty out of Austin. He was on the Atheist Experience. He's since left the show, but he would always bring it up. And, he was the first one to mention it. And then so I started studying and I started reading Bible scholarship on it. And, even a lot of time there's a site called Sefaria, which has a lot of Jewish texts, and you can look at the Tanakh, the Old Testament, and it has links to all the rabbinic commentaries on it. And they're clear, that yes, it's talking about slavery, and they were fine with it. But again, they're writing in the time where slavery was still an accepted thing.
It was culturally moral then.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it was, nobody batted an eye. Nobody thought of it, And, but it's so hard to get people to understand that, Christians, because a lot of times they will, they'll try to justify it and make it not what it is. And I guess, my main argument that I do, it's like, I'm not judging it as saying it's immoral, although it is by our standards, but we can't judge them by our standards because they didn't have our standards. But you have to call it what it was. And you have to acknowledge that, yes, this existed and no one had a problem with it. But the danger of doing that is that it casts shade on God, especially since the commands came from him. So yeah, a lot of my study, it's, along biblical scholarship on these hot button topics, like the whole idea with, abortion, regardless of which side you fall on it, the Bible really doesn't say anything about it. There's a Bible scholar named Dan McClellan. He's very active on YouTube and TikTok. And he's a public-facing scholar. He doesn't work for any institution per se. His faith practice is a Mormon, but he keeps his scholarship separate. And so when he, makes a video on appointed scholarship, it does not reflect Mormon doctrine. And, he's just very blunt and open about what things mean. And, this idea, he's made several videos on abortion and about, at what point they argue, and how there was this constant argument of when the soul enters the child. And it was never something that was set in stone. Even among the rabbis, they had different times. Aristotle had his own. And so eventually the church adopted a certain position, and that's become what the truth is. But that was because it was decided on, 400 years after Jesus. It's not something that it's always been this way. But, people tend to take that and say, well, that's because it's always been that way. It's like, no, that's not how it works. And Dan's the one who introduced me to the concept of renegotiation, and how that, every generation, sometimes multiple times, you renegotiate the text, and I guess with LGBT is a big example. Back growing up in Silsbee, there were 3 things that a preacher could preach, and it would guarantee that people would be up running the aisles, and the worship in Silsbee was off the chain demonstrative. We had people go and at times jump fully clothed into the baptistry and just
sorry.
Yeah, it's insane. In that context, it made sense. But since then, thinking about it, you're like, why in the world would you do that? But the 3 things were the oneness of God, plan of salvation, Acts 2:38, and against homosexuality. And so you're up there railing against people who are gay, and you've got people running the aisles, and it's like, where's
you're
the
preaching
logic?
Against homosexuality, and you've got people sitting on your platform committing adultery.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And it's funny, there's a friend of mine, he was about 5-6 years older than I was. He went to the same Christian school. When he was in his early 20s, first he became an atheist, but he was also came out as gay. And he didn't come out to anyone. He was outed as being gay. And he had started an online forum. It was called Ex-Pentecostal. Got really popular.
I think I remember that, actually.
Yeah. And he's the one that started it. And he was preached by name, his site by name, and he became persona non grata. You did not say anything positive about this guy because he was Satan himself. And I couldn't reconcile that. It's like, I know this guy. He's my friend. He's gay, and yeah, I think that's wrong. I believed at the time that it was a sin, but it's like, I'm not going to throw away my friendship with this guy over that. I'm not going to openly condemn him for it. And that was one of those things that you just kind of tuck away, and there's probably some cognitive dissonance there, but you just have to make the choice of, I'm going to choose humanity over whatever this dogma is. And there again, they go back and use these same few verses. Paul's got a few, and there's a few in the Old Testament that use against homosexuality, but that's because of the way the Bible's translated. It was not talking about people having a same-sex relationship. It was talking about the sexual act, and there was a certain reason why they condemned the sexual act. And it didn't have anything to do with relationships, And so again, you have to get into the mindset and the context of what, how they understood it. But people don't, it's easier just to, you can write all these people off by using Romans 1, God gave them up to vile lust. And it's like, you read that in context and like, this doesn't even make sense because it's referring to what happened at Mount Sinai. There's no description of, people doing that there, so, but yeah, it's funny. I think I probably study the Bible more now than I did when I was a Christian. Because, it's just trying to understand it in a way that, places it in its right context. I think it's an important work. It's a very important literary work, but I just think, you need to understand it as it was delivered at the time. There's a context, and if you use the Bible to interpret the Bible, you don't get that context at all. So,
no, I think it was Anne Rice that said, you've created God in your own image when He hates all the same people you do. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what we tend to do. We and not just the Christian Bible. We tend to take whatever religion we are, manipulate it to believe like I believe.
Yeah.
And instead of just understanding that, you're taking something and using it against people.
Right.
And that's my issue. You know, I mean, I'll be the first one to say I signed up for a class here recently that kind of walks you through kind of what Robert Allen did with the Old Testament and all these things, but it's going back to the Sumerian tablets and the these old, you know, documents, these stone tablets that are, you know, 250,000 years ago, which, you know, a little bit longer than 6,000. You know, slightly older, just a minute bit, and you know, I can regurgitate some things that I've heard about these tablets, but it appears, the thing is that I'm taking this class so that I can kind of figure it out on my own, without listening to whomever it is I need to listen to, or whoever it is talking, which I'm thankful for those people, because they kind of turn on wow, that's interesting. Let me go work out my own salvation. With fear and trembling, you know, salvation. Let me go figure this out. Especially when this guy's saying, you know, he's proclaiming that a lot of even biblical text is copied almost word from word from ancient Sumerian tablets, which I'm extremely interested in. It doesn't make the tablets spiritual even. I mean, and he doesn't say they're spiritual. There's these discussions about people that have this, you know, technologically they're more advanced than what we think they were, and these things. And is it true? I don't know, but I want to go read it and understand how to translate it, and understand how to use that, how to debate people. And by debate, I don't mean like you're going to hell and I'm right and you're wrong, but more like, this is what I see and you disagree with me. Because if I'm looking at that as like, this is what I see, you say something different, then, well, maybe I'm wrong. You know, but you can't go into that thinking I'm going to be the end all. And the preacher, the word, the mediator between man and Jesus. You know, which is what preachers tend to believe these days, as opposed to like, okay, this is what I believe. What do you think about it? And if I can't hear you because you know, you look a little bit different than I do, or you believe a little bit different than I do, or you're politically different than I am, I'm not going to be able to grow as a person, as a human. And isn't that why we're here? I mean, to me, that's the purpose. Whether you believe in God or heaven or hell, whatever the fuck, I don't give a shit. I want to grow as a person. I want to be the best version of whatever it is that I'm supposed to be. And I don't know what the fuck that is, but you know what? I'm trying my best, you know?
Well, that's it. If you're pursuing truth, that has to include an openness to be wrong and to be corrected.
Yeah.
You know? And
otherwise, what's the point?
Right. A lot of people they pursue the capital T truth. Which is very dogmatic, you know, but because things are subject to change, you know, we find out new information all the time.
Well, I started saying a long time ago, I think even when I was on Rhema, you know, I started Rhema, I started it, Ron came in right after that, and everybody knew Ron, so he would pull a lot of people in. Nobody knew who I was, you know, but everybody knew Ron. And even back then, I began to say, you know, it's about the journey, not the destination. You know, and at that time I was talking about Christianity. It's about the journey. But as I started down that journey, I began to realize this Christian shit is not destiny. It's not the destination. You know, this atheism is not the destination. The destination is trying to figure out what is real. And understanding that I'm probably never going to actually arrive there. You know, it's this, I've got to shed this idea that I'm going to arrive, and then I'm going to be able to talk to Robert and convince Robert that I'm right, because, you know, I'm going to be the arbiter between, you know, heaven and hell.
You know, you mentioned the ancient texts. It's funny. Some of the laws, I think it's regarding slavery, in the Torah were almost verbatim from the law of Hammurabi, which it predated the Torah by 1,000 years. And, you know, people treat the Old Testament as if it was, you know, divine command. God is dropping this heretofore unknown knowledge that tells us all how to live moral, perfect lives. But one of the things on slavery, if a man entered into indentured servitude, or signed his family to enter into indentured servitude, as it was, the Bible says they served 6 years to go out on the Sabbath if they were a Hebrew. However, the Code of Hammurabi, which was 1,000 years earlier, their limits on indentured servitude were 3 years. You are set free on the fourth. So how is the Bible revolutionary if it's a worse version of what already existed? And it's not like we don't have these law codes. We have Middle Assyrian, the Hittites. Archaeology has discovered these, and we have the sources and have people who understand how to translate them. And pretty much when you read the Bible, with few exceptions, and those exceptions have to do with identity markers as setting Israel apart from everybody else. But aside from those things, it was pretty par for the course. Their laws were the same as everybody else's. It's just...
When you take into effect that Moses spent over, 30, 40 years in the house of Pharaoh, being raised by Pharaoh, having access to the Library of Alexandria and its ancient text, it's not surprising that our scripture is a copy carbon of ancient text.
Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Right.
And people tend to want to think that because it somehow makes your belief more legit, and saying everything is influenced by everything else around it.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you look at the Quran, Moses or the Prophet Muhammad pulls from the Christian text. It was just everybody's pulling from the text before them.
Yeah, exactly.
Or from anywhere,
Right.
And then writing it according to what makes me more powerful and more in control. Me, whoever that is, that in the case of the, because Jesus read the King James, so that's the only one that we're allowed to read. It's actually heard somebody say that from the pulpit. We only can read. Jesus read the King James. I don't know if they were joking or not, but in our environment, we probably weren't. We probably actually thought that
in the KJV Baptist. No, it's legit. That was legit. That was not a parody at all.
Jesus was the greatest American who ever attended Sunday school.
Yeah, exactly. Spoke in tongues, ran the aisles, a whole 9 yards.
Exactly.
But
if you take the text and you apply it, or you put that into perspective of, number one, God told me, and number one, this is how I'm interpreting it, and I'm the law, then you can do and say anything you want. With no repercussions of it, because who's to argue with God is the idea behind that.
And one crazy thing, especially with standards, I've downloaded a bunch of UPC manuals, David Bernard's books, different things. There was one book I had, it was a manual of holiness standards, and it was scriptural reasons why you did it. And I never thought about it until I separated from it, but it's like, why is it that you have all these biblical standards regarding the way that men and women are supposed to look that are based on 1950s American culture?
Yeah.
It's like, that didn't exist. Like the guy who was arguing about the beard. It's like, you don't realize that in that culture, everyone had a beard. You weren't a man if you didn't have a beard, and you were a Jew.
Yeah.
So Jesus himself had a beard.
I was licensed with UPC, and unfortunately, I attended a ministerial conference, and I'm sitting there. One of the many moments of being woke up, was I sat in the pew, and like you, Robert, I was very sincere in my pursuance. I wanted to be right. I wanted to be right. Wanted to be holy, and there was a sincerity there. And I'm attending a local ministerial conference, and the Texas district superintendent at the time stood up, was preaching this message, and I will never forget it to this day. He picked up the UPC manual, and he held up the manual, knowing that it was a manual. It wasn't the scripture, right? And it was an accident that I picked up the manual. But he picks up the manual, and he says, if we are ever to make it to heaven, we must follow this book. For this book was founded on the Bible. So if we ever to go to heaven, it's by this book alone. And I sit there going, I just did not hear
Yeah.
what I just heard. But yeah, there's a blatant disregard for the text.
Yeah.
And then a complete interpretation of, like Nathan says, the end game. How do we get there?
Right.
And we get there by this 1950s manual.
Exactly. Yeah.
And
It's funny because
go ahead.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
All right.
I was just going to bring up that. Go ahead. I'll stop.
Go
Ahead. Well, you know, to me, it goes back to, like you guys were saying. I think it was Mason that said earlier that the man of God, quote unquote, becomes the mouthpiece, that arbiter of truth, that door within which we view God, you know, or window, or whatever you want to call it. You know, that kind, if we kind of go back to what you were talking about when we first started, where you're talking about your story and your experience and everything that you've went through, you know, I mean, that in itself is the best environment for trauma to happen. Because you've got men who put their pants on one leg at a time, shit like I do, piss like I do. They do everything exactly the same as me, except most of them, and this is going to be, well, I don't give a fuck. Most of them aren't intelligent enough to think their way out of a fucking wet paper bag. And then they're wanting to make certain statements about gay or whatever the fuck, whatever. And you at 11 years old, if you don't speak in tongues, bless God, I'm gonna beat you till you do, or I'm gonna condemn you till you do, or I'm gonna berate you till you do. You know, that's rife with trauma, and you're right. I don't think, I'd be willing to bet that 90%, 99% of the churches, not just UPC either, this is probably across the board, have some sort of version of what we went through. Maybe not as stringent and as strict, but you know, it's rife. It's an environment that I would go as far as to say encourages trauma,
Right.
because that's built into it. I mean, I think I think it's been on the podcast that I've said, you know, the idea of original sin. That means that I'm born fallen and broken and unworthy and bad and evil and satanic, and you know, and if you're naturally doing what you're naturally doing, then that is evil in itself. And so everything that you do from that point on is considered evil and sin. And it's no wonder that people, like you said, don't turn to alcohol or don't turn to certain, and I don't have a problem. I mean, fuck, I'm drinking some shit right now, but you know, there's no wonder that we try to medicate ourselves to overcome that, so that I can love myself at some point, so that I can understand that, you know what, I'm not a bad guy. You know, I've got shit, yes, but we all got shit, and most of it's from religion. If we just stop doing that shit, stop teaching our kids that shit, and start look, you know, I'm a manager at my job. I've got 5 people that report to me, and the way I manage is, it's funny because I'll sit down with every new person that comes on board. Have you ever heard of Mike Yaconelli? Did you ever read any of his books? He's passed now, but he wrote a book called Messy Spirituality. This guy was like, if I had to go to church, I would want to go to this guy's church. He talks about, you know, he had the worst growing church in America. He said when I took to church, it ran 135 people. He said now it runs 35 people, and it's because he just would not get up and preach fundamentalism or some stringent thing. And he said, you know, we had this lady get up and they would have somebody new from the church get up and start the church with prayer, and she's praying and she messes up. And she goes, "Oh fuck," you know. And he was like, "That was my church," you know. We didn't condemn her. That's just what she felt at the time. But there's a story that he tells. He said, you know, we always try to live 100% for God, you know, and he's still in a Christian context. So he's trying to live 100% for God. He said it. So we wake up in the morning, we're freshly up, we're slept good through the night, and I'm going to live 100. I'm going to give God 100%. He said we walk by the TV and Baywatch is on, and suddenly that 100% goes down to 75% because you know there's boobies on the screen, and I'm looking,
Exactly.
and so you know, and then you stump your toe and you're like, son of